They say the measure of a man is what he leaves behind. But for me, it was always about what I held on to. I held my son's tiny hand at his mother's funeral when he was just 7. I held his backpack straps every morning before school, tightening them so they wouldn't slip. I held my breath through unpaid bills just to keep the lights on for his homework. I didn't have much, but I had him. And in those days, when he needed me most, I was everything. A father, a shield, and his only home. Time has a strange way of loosening bonds you once believed unbreakable. One thread at a time. You don't notice it at first. A missed call here. A shorter visit there. But then, one day, you wake up and realize the boy who once ran into your arms now walks past you without slowing down. Caleb used to call me every Sunday evening, like clockwork. We'd talk about football, weather, the neighbor's barking dog, nothing that mattered, yet everything that did. I lived for those 10 minutes. His voice was like a bridge to a world I helped build. But over time, the calls started coming later. Then shorter. Then, sometimes, not at all. Sorry, Dad. Been slammed this week. Work's been brutal. We just got back from Denver. Angela's parents are thinking of moving out there, too. Angela. She was polite, well-spoken, always smiling. But cold in that way that never shows up in photographs. When they got married 5 years ago, I smiled through the whole ceremony. But deep inside, I felt something shift. Like a door that had always been open, quietly clicked shut. She started answering his phone sometimes. "Hi, Mr. Thompson. Caleb's in a meeting, can he call you back later?" He rarely did. I convinced myself it was normal. He was building a life, after all. I didn't want to be the kind of father who clings too tight, who makes guilt a form of affection. So I gave space. Told myself it was love, just quieter now. Then birthdays started coming without a card. No more handwritten notes, just a text. Sometimes not even on the right day. One year, he forgot entirely. I sat at the kitchen table with a candle and a cupcake my neighbor's daughter had brought over. She called me Uncle Harold. She remembered. My son didn't. But I didn't call him to remind him. I just stared at the flame until it flickered out. When I tried bringing up how I felt, he always responded the same way. "You know I love you, Dad. You don't need a phone call to prove that." Maybe that was true. Or maybe he just didn't want the reminder anymore, that there was a man, miles away, who once gave everything so he could have anything. He and Angela bought a house in Austin last year. Sent me pictures of the backyard and the new kitchen. "We'll have you over sometime soon," he said. They never did. Instead, Angela would call once a month to check in. "How's your health, Harold? Still able to manage the stairs? Do you have a power of attorney yet? It's smart to plan early, just in case." I knew what she was really asking. How close are you to becoming someone else's responsibility? But I answered kindly. Always kindly. Because I didn't want to believe what I was starting to feel. That I wasn't part of their future, I was just a piece of their planning. I still remembered the boy who cried on my chest when he couldn't find his soccer cleats. Who used to leave drawings on my pillow, signing them, to Dad, the best. That boy was gone. Not dead. Not cruel. Just, absorbed by something colder. Busier. Bigger than me. Maybe success does that. Maybe the world rewards forgetfulness when it's dressed up as ambition. All I know is, the more successful Caleb became, the less he looked back. And the less he looked back, the more invisible I became. Until one day, I wasn't a father anymore. I was just a man with the same last name. It happened on a Tuesday. A quiet, ordinary sort of morning. The kind where you don't expect anything to change, and yet, everything does. I was making tea. Earl Grey. Same as every morning. I had the kettle on the stove, humming faintly while I searched the fridge for milk. The light flickered slightly when I bent down to grab it, and then, all at once, the world tilted. Not in a metaphorical way. No, the floor actually tilted. The room spun. My chest tightened like a fist curling inside my ribs. I gripped the counter, tried to steady myself. But my knees gave out, and I collapsed like a dropped marionette, arms limp, breath stolen. I hit the floor hard. The sound of the kettle whistling felt cruel. It kept screaming, as if mocking me, or warning someone I knew would never come. In that moment, I wasn't thinking about death. I was thinking about Caleb. My hands were shaking, but I still managed to pull myself toward the table, where my cell phone sat charging. Every movement was a war. I could feel the pressure in my chest spreading, clawing up toward my throat. When I reached the phone, I swiped it open and hit his name. The first number in my favorites. The one I used to call with pride, like I was dialing a future I had helped build. It rang. And rang. And rang. Then voicemail. I tried again. This time I pressed the speaker button so I wouldn't have to hold it. I whispered into the open air, "Caleb, it's me. I need you. Please, son. I don't think I can." My voice broke. The phone slid from my palm, landing face down on the cold tile floor. That was the last thing I remember. Not pain. Not panic. Just the hollow sound of my own son's silence echoing back through the receiver. When I opened my eyes again, I was in a hospital bed. Tubes in my arm. Monitor beeping like a distant metronome. The ceiling above me was white and blank. I stared at it for a long time before I remembered where I was, or why. A nurse walked in. She looked young. Compassionate. She smiled softly, like she didn't want to wake a memory. "You're lucky," she said. "Your neighbor heard something crash and came knocking. When you didn't answer, he called 911. "Neighbor?" I asked, my voice thin. She nodded. "Mr. Lawson, I think. From next door?" I swallowed hard. "Did anyone else call?" "My son. His name is Caleb." She glanced at the chart in her hand, then back at me. "No, sir. No calls yet." That was day 1. Day 2 was the same. I asked the nurse again. "Any messages?" She shook her head, apologetically. By day 3, I was still in the same bed, hooked to the same machines. The nurse, her name was Leah, offered to try calling Caleb herself. She did. I watched her walk just outside the room, phone pressed to her ear. She came back 5 minutes later, looking smaller somehow. More burdened. "He answered," she said gently. My eyes lit up. "But, he said he's in the middle of a product launch at work. He said he'd try to reach out when things settle down." I nodded slowly. Not because I understood. But because pretending to understand is easier than falling apart in front of someone who pities you. I turned my head toward the window. It was raining. I watched the droplets race each other down the glass, wondering if one of them might win. No visitors. No callbacks. No sun. Only the steady beep of a machine and a folded blanket that smelled like bleach. That's when I realized something I hadn't wanted to believe. My life could end in that bed, in that moment, and the person I loved most in this world wouldn't even know until it was convenient for him. I wasn't a father anymore. I was a missed call. An interruption. A voicemail that didn't need returning. And lying there, alone in that room, I didn't cry. I just let the silence settle over me like a second blanket. Heavy. Suffocating. And far too familiar. The hardest part wasn't the pain. It wasn't the tubes or the bruises on my arms or even the slow ache that made it hard to sit up. No, the hardest part was the door. That door stayed closed for 3 days. Every time I heard footsteps in the hallway, I'd glance toward it. I'd imagine Caleb walking in, carrying one of those coffees he used to drink. Maybe a forced smile on his face. Maybe guilt in his eyes. Anything. I would have taken anything over what I got. Nothing. No knock. No phone call. No text message asking if I was alive. Just the occasional nurse, bless their hearts, coming in with warm hands and soft words, but none of them were him. On the morning of the 3rd day, I finally asked the nurse again. Would you mind trying him one more time? Her name was Leah. She'd been kind from the start, offering me extra blankets and asking if I wanted the window cracked open for fresh air. She nodded, stepped out into the hallway with her phone. I watched her through the glass. I couldn't hear what was said, but I saw her posture change. She was smiling when the call began, professional, polite. Then her shoulders dropped. Her hand moved slower. Her eyes dimmed. She ended the call and walked back in, looking like someone who had just been forced to break a promise. He answered, she said quietly. But he's in a meeting. I nodded. She stood there for a moment, holding the phone in both hands like it was something fragile. He said he hopes you're okay and that he'll check in later this week. Of course, I whispered. She tried to smile again, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. And that was it. No voice message. No card. Not even a flower delivered through one of those apps I know he uses for his wife's birthday. Just, nothing. I turned my head to the wall and stared at the small clock mounted above the TV. Tick. 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 Time moved. People moved. The world outside kept spinning. But in that room, I felt like I'd disappeared. Not because of age. Not because of sickness. But because someone had made a decision, a quiet, unconscious decision, that I no longer mattered. I started replaying moments in my head. The times I held Caleb as he cried about a scraped knee. The day he didn't make the soccer team and I told him he was still my champion. The graduation speech I listened to from the back row, clapping the hardest for the boy who said I was his hero. And now. I was inconvenient. I wasn't angry yet. That would come later. This wasn't anger. This was grief. Grief for a relationship I hadn't realized was already gone. A nurse down the hall laughed, probably at some joke another patient made. It sounded like something far away, like music from another lifetime. I remember thinking how strange it was, the contrast of life continuing around you, while your own seems to pause mid-sentence. When the nurse came back in later to check my vitals, she hesitated by the foot of my bed. Do you have any other family, Mr. Thompson? I shook my head. My wife passed 22 years ago. It's just me and my son. She nodded, then gently adjusted the 4-line. I could feel she wanted to say something, maybe offer comfort. But she didn't. Maybe she knew there was nothing that would make it better. As she walked out, she paused. He should be here, she said. Then she closed the door. That night, I didn't sleep. I stared at the ceiling and listened to the beep of the heart monitor. A quiet, faithful reminder that I was still here. Still breathing. Still waiting. But no one was coming. And that silence? That silence told me everything I needed to know. Have you ever begged for love that should have been given freely? Tell me below. 3 days after I returned home from the hospital, Angela showed up at my doorstep. She didn't call ahead. She never does. Just knocked twice, then opened the door like it belonged to her. I suppose, in her mind, it already did. Hi, Harold, she sang out, holding a paper bag in one hand and her oversized purse in the other. I brought you soup. Organic. Low sodium. I forced a smile. Thanks, Angela. You didn't have to. Of course I did, she said. Your family. She moved through my home like a real estate agent, glancing at the furniture, the walls, the dust on the window frames. I watched her take it all in, not with concern, but calculation. She set the bag down on the kitchen counter and started unpacking. There's a bit of chicken and wild rice, some crackers, and I got you those little yogurts you like. Caleb told me you used to buy them by the dozen. I nodded. I hadn't had one in over a year. She handed me a spoon like a mother feeding a child. I took it, because refusing would feel like war. But the taste didn't matter. What filled my mouth wasn't soup, it was silence. She sat across from me, crossed her legs, and smiled. So, how are you feeling? Still sore, I said. Weak in the mornings. She nodded like a doctor. That's normal. You're lucky it wasn't worse. Caleb was really shaken up when I told him. I tilted my head. He didn't tell me that. She waved her hand gently. Oh, you know how he is, bottles everything up. I let that sit there, untouched. There was a pause. Then she leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice as if delivering a secret meant to sound like love. Have you ever thought about assisted living? There it was. I didn't respond. Just looked at her, long enough to make her eyes shift away. She continued, with the sweetness of a sales pitch. Not because you can't live on your own, of course. You're very capable. But what if there's another episode? No one would be here. And Caleb, well, he travels a lot for work. I stayed silent. She kept going. There's this wonderful place just outside Austin. Peaceful, secure, great medical staff. You'd have a private room, and we could visit every weekend. It'd be nice. You wouldn't be alone. She smiled again. Practiced. Kind. And cold. This wasn't care. It was cleanup. It was strategic positioning, like removing the last piece from a chessboard so the game could end. She wasn't offering help. She was managing a transition. My transition. Out of relevance. Out of my own home. Out of their way. I looked around the house, my house. Every creak in the floorboards, every scratch on the table, every photograph on the wall, it all carried my wife's touch, my memories, my sweat. And yet, I could already see Angela mentally repainting the walls. I appreciate your concern, I finally said. But this is my home. I plan to die here. She gave a polite little laugh. Oh, Harold. Don't be dramatic. But I wasn't smiling. And I didn't look away. She changed the subject quickly, asked if I needed anything from the store, mentioned something about Caleb's next business trip, then glanced at her watch. I'll leave you to rest, she said, standing. She walked toward the door, then paused. If you change your mind about the facility, let me know. They're filling up fast. Then she left. And for the first time in a long time, I locked the door behind someone I once called family. I stood there, hand on the doorknob, listening to the quiet hum of my refrigerator and the clock ticking above the hallway mirror. That's when I knew. They weren't waiting for me to decline. They were preparing for it. Planning for it. Trying to make it easier for themselves when the time came to say goodbye, not with grief, but with signatures. And I, the man who once built a home from nothing, was now just a logistical problem waiting to be solved. That night, I sat on my recliner, staring at the darkened window. And I thought to myself, if they've already written the ending to my story, then maybe it's time I take the pen back. That night, after Angela left, I didn't sleep. I sat in my old recliner, surrounded by the hum of appliances and the creaks of a house built before my son was born. I stared at the photograph on the mantel, my wife, Evelyn, standing in front of this very home, holding Caleb as a toddler. She had one hand shielding his eyes from the sun, and the other resting on her stomach. Back then, she used to say this house would be our legacy. A home filled with memories, passed down through generations. I wondered what she'd say if she saw what it had become. A transaction. A target. I stood up slowly, my legs still unsteady, and walked to the hallway closet. Behind the coats and the folded linens, there was a small metal box. It hadn't been touched in over a decade. I pulled it out, brushed off the thin layer of dust, and opened the latch. Inside were the things most people would call sentimental. But to me, they were sacred. Evelyn's letters. Our old mortgage papers. A copy of my original will, the one I drew up before Caleb was old enough to spell inheritance. And her journal. I hadn't read it since the year she passed. Flipping it open, I didn't know what I was looking for. Maybe comfort. Maybe courage. What I found was a line written in her careful, looping hand. If they forget your love, remember your dignity. I read it 3 times. Then once more aloud. That line didn't sting. It steadied me. Because I realized then, dignity doesn't ask for permission. It doesn't wait to be acknowledged. It simply exists, until you let someone take it. And I'd let them chip away at mine for too long. So the next morning, I got dressed. Slowly. Carefully. Like a man preparing for something sacred. Not war. Not revenge. Just reclamation. I took the city bus to my lawyer's office. A small, brick building near the courthouse, with a cracked sign that hadn't been changed in years. He was surprised to see me, offered me coffee and asked how the little one was doing. He still thought of Caleb as a boy. So did I, sometimes. But that morning, I told him what I wanted. No hesitation. No trembling voice. I want the deed put back in my name alone, I said. Remove Caleb as co-owner. He blinked. Are you sure? I nodded. I'm not punishing him. I'm just protecting what's left of me. Then I revised my will. Removed Caleb and Angela as primary beneficiaries. Set up a charitable trust in Evelyn's name. One that would fund scholarships for kids from single-parent homes. Kids like Caleb used to be. Kids who still held their parents' hands. Finally, I updated my power of attorney, assigning it to a longtime neighbor, a kind woman who once sat with me on the porch after Evelyn's funeral. A woman who brought me soup when I was sick, not because she had an agenda, but because she knew how it felt to be alone. Every signature I placed on paper felt like a breath I didn't realize I was holding. Not because I wanted to hurt my son. But because I had waited too long to protect myself from the idea that love, once given, would always return. It doesn't. Sometimes it fades. Sometimes it calcifies into obligation. Sometimes it hides behind polite smiles and just checking in phone calls. And sometimes, it simply forgets you. I left that office feeling lighter. Not joyful. Not victorious. Just, right. I took the bus home. Watched people come and go. Students, workers, a mother with a baby on her chest. I wondered if that child would grow up to remember what her mother gave up, or if she'd someday look through her mother like a window. When I got back home, I placed Evelyn's journal on the nightstand. I didn't cry. I didn't rage. I just sat down and listened to the silence, and for the first time, it didn't feel like something happening to me. It felt like something I owned. Something I had chosen. Because I realized something I should have known all along. I don't need permission to matter. Not from Caleb. Not from Angela. Not from anyone who only calls when they need a signature or a surrender. I was a father. I was a husband. I was a man. And I still am. My 80th birthday came on a Saturday. There was no party. No balloons or candles. I didn't want any of that. I was too tired to pretend joy for the sake of photographs. I woke up early that morning, poured myself a cup of coffee, and sat by the window as the sun rose, slow and stubborn. For a moment, I thought maybe this year would pass quietly. But around noon, Caleb's car pulled into the driveway. A white Lexus, clean, cold, and far too shiny for the street it parked on. He stepped out, adjusting his tie like he'd just come from a meeting. Angela followed, holding a white box with a gold ribbon. "Happy birthday, Dad," Caleb said, leaning in for a brief hug. It was the kind of hug you give your boss at a retirement party, not your father. Angela smiled, as if rehearsed. 80 years. That's quite a milestone. I nodded. I suppose it is. They handed me the box. Inside was a cake, store-bought, too neat, too perfect. Chocolate ganache. No candles. No writing. I placed it gently on the counter. We sat in the living room, the three of us. Caleb on his phone, Angela making small talk about the weather in Austin, about a new yoga class she'd started. They didn't ask how I'd been sleeping since the hospital. They didn't ask if the chest pain had come back. They didn't ask what it felt like to lie alone in a room waiting for someone who never came. Angela pulled out a brochure from her purse, casually sliding it onto the coffee table like a restaurant menu. "It's called Willow Pines," she said. "It's not too far from Austin. Great staff. Full medical support. You'd have your own room, your own space." I looked at the glossy images. Smiling seniors playing cards. Raised garden beds. A fake fireplace in the dining hall. I didn't touch it. I didn't say a word. Caleb didn't look up from his phone. They stayed for 23 minutes. Not a second more. When they left, Angela kissed my cheek. "Think about the brochure, okay?" Caleb mumbled something about a conference next week and promised to call. He didn't take the cake with him. After the door closed, I stood there in the middle of the room. The silence felt louder than ever. I walked to the kitchen, cut a slice of the untouched cake, and sat at the table. No candles. No singing. Just me. And the growing weight of what I already knew. But the real moment came later that evening. I was taking the trash out, something I still did myself, no matter how many times Angela hinted that it was too much at your age. As I opened the bin, a slip of paper caught my eye. Not mine. It was a pamphlet. From a real estate agent in Austin. I recognized the logo immediately. Angela used to brag about their services. But it wasn't the company that stopped me cold. It was the handwritten circle in black ink around my home address. My house. My name. My life. I stared at it for a long time, the way a man stares at a gravestone with his own name on it. They hadn't just thought about where to put me. They had started planning what to do with what I would leave behind. Before I was even gone. Not dead. Not disabled. Just inconvenient. I walked back inside, shut the door softly, and sat down. I didn't cry. I didn't curse them. I didn't call Caleb and ask for an explanation. I just picked up a pen. I opened Evelyn's journal to the back page. And I started writing. Not to argue. Not to convince. But to say the things I had swallowed for far too long. The hospital. The silence. The door that never opened. The house they wanted before I had even left it. They had sent me cake and a brochure. I would send them something too. Not out of anger. But out of clarity. Out of love, not for them, but for myself. Because something finally clicked that night. They had written the script of my final chapters without ever asking if I wanted to speak. Now, it was my turn. Would you recognize love if it came dressed as strategy? The letter took me 2 days to write. Not because I didn't know what to say. I knew exactly what needed saying. But the words, they came slowly. Not because they were painful. But because they had waited too long to be heard. I sat at the kitchen table, the same spot where I once taught Caleb how to tie his shoes. Where I read Evelyn's obituary 22 years ago. Where I signed the mortgage, the adoption papers for our first dog, the birthday cards we used to make by hand. And now, a different kind of paper sat before me. The letter began simply. Caleb, this may be the last thing I write to you, not out of habit, but out of necessity. I told him about the hospital. How I had called. Twice. How I whispered his name into a phone that never spoke back. How I woke up not to him, but to a nurse with kind eyes and a clipboard full of strangers. I told him about the silence. The kind that doesn't echo, it absorbs. About the room I stared at for 3 days, waiting for a door that never opened. I told him that I forgave him for not coming. But I could no longer pretend he didn't leave. I reminded him of the day I gave him half the house, how proud I felt, how generous. I had told myself it was a gift. But really, it was a tether. A last-ditch attempt to stay needed. I told him the deed now belonged solely to me again. No fight. No drama. Just a fact. I told him about Evelyn's journal. The sentence she wrote that changed everything. If they forget your love, remember your dignity. I reminded him that I had not forgotten. But I had remembered something far more important. Myself. I wrote of the real estate flyer I found in the trash. The circle around my address. The invisible X over my future. I didn't accuse. I didn't insult. I just clarified. I told him that I wasn't leaving this house. That it would go to someone who needed it, not someone who assumed it. I told him I'd created a trust in his mother's name. That the home would become a shelter for youth aging out of foster care. Because they knew what it meant to be forgotten. And they didn't hide behind suits and strategy when they needed love. I ended the letter not with a goodbye. But with a choice. You don't have to be the man you've become, Caleb. But I no longer have the strength to wait for someone who already turned away. I folded the pages slowly. Put them in an envelope. Wrote his name in block letters. I didn't seal it with anger. I sealed it with a kind of peace I hadn't felt in years. I walked to the postbox myself. Each step was careful. Not weak. Not slow. Deliberate. It was a sunny morning. The kind of morning that lies to you about what's coming. There was a breeze in the air. The leaves on the maple trees danced like nothing had happened. And yet, something had. The weather had changed. Not outside. Inside me. I wasn't a forgotten man anymore. I was a father who had spoken his truth. Not for pity. Not for apology. But to finally be heard, even if the only ears that listened belonged to the wind. When I dropped the letter into the box, it didn't feel like surrender. It felt like closure with a heartbeat. A quiet kind of thunder. I didn't know what Caleb would do when he read it. Whether he'd come. Whether he'd rage. Whether he'd tear it apart and throw it in some hotel trash can. But that was no longer mine to carry. I had said what needed to be said. The rest? That was up to the man on the other side of the silence. For days passed after I sent the letter. For mornings of quiet tea. For evenings of watching shadows stretch across the living room walls like old regrets. I didn't expect him to show up. Not really. A man who ignores his father's voice during a heart attack doesn't typically sprint back home because of a few folded pages. But on the fifth morning, just after sunrise, I saw a car pull into the driveway. Not the Lexus. A rental. Dust on the hood, bugs on the grill. No shine. No polish. Caleb stepped out. Alone. No suitcase. No phone in hand. No Angela. Just him, in an old sweatshirt I hadn't seen since college, and shoes that looked like they hadn't touched carpet in weeks. I didn't move to greet him. I just opened the door and let it hang wide. He walked in slow, like a man entering his own memory. His eyes didn't scan the walls or the furniture. He looked straight at me. And for the first time in years, he didn't look past me. He looked at me. We stood in silence. Heavy, aching silence. Then he spoke. I read your letter. His voice cracked, but not with rehearsed emotion. This wasn't performance. This was raw. I didn't respond. I let the stillness force him to find his own way forward. He stepped closer, hands shaking. I don't have an excuse. He looked down at his feet. I told myself I was too busy. That work was stressful. That I'd call tomorrow. And then, tomorrow came, and I didn't. I thought, if I stayed distant, I wouldn't have to see what I'd done. What I'd become. He swallowed hard. I heard your voice on that voicemail, Dad. After the nurse called me, I listened to it. He paused. And I erased it. I couldn't face it. I felt something shift in my chest. Not forgiveness. Not yet. But a door creaked open. One I hadn't touched in a long time. He continued. When Angela brought up the care home, I let her. I told myself it was practical. Logical. I didn't want to be responsible. I didn't want to feel the weight. He took a shaky breath. You were never a weight. Not once. But I made you one. I sat down slowly, the ache in my bones louder than usual. He didn't sit. He stood there, trembling. Why didn't you tell me about the will? He asked. Because, I said, I needed to know you saw me as your father. Not a deed. Not a problem to be solved. Just, a man who raised you. He blinked fast, trying to hold something back. I don't deserve forgiveness. I know, I said. He nodded. And I'm not asking for the house. Or the money. Or to be put back in the papers. I'm not here to fix anything. I looked at him. I'm here to sit with what I broke. Those words landed like a stone in still water. He sank to his knees beside my chair. I'm sorry, Dad. That's when I reached out. Not because he earned it. But because I saw, for the first time in a long time, the boy I raised. Not the man molded by success and schedules. But the boy who used to cry when I missed bedtime. I placed my hand on his shoulder. And I forgave him. Not with words. With presence. Forgiveness doesn't always sound like, I forgive you. Sometimes it sounds like two people breathing in the same room again. He sat there for a long time. Knees on the floor. Face in his hands. And I let the silence speak for both of us. He didn't ask to be written back into the will. He didn't ask about the house. And I didn't offer. Because sometimes the deepest healing isn't about restoration. It's about recognition. And what Caleb gave me that day wasn't an excuse. It was something better. The truth. If someone finally saw your pain, would you offer them peace? It's been 6 months since Caleb came back. He never moved back in. Never asked to. He comes on Sundays now, just after church, wearing worn jeans and bringing coffee, not from some chain, but from the little cafe 3 blocks away where I used to take him after school. He doesn't talk much during those visits. And neither do I. Sometimes we sit in the backyard, pulling weeds from between the stones. Sometimes we just watch the wind move through the trees and pretend the silence is full of things we're still not ready to say. But it's different now. Not heavier. Lighter. He doesn't ask about the will. Not once. He hasn't mentioned the trust, or the house, or what I did with the papers. I think he knows the answer. I think he understood the moment I didn't hand him a second chance on a silver platter, that this wasn't about punishment. It was about peace. And peace isn't something you inherit. It's something you earn, slowly, through presence. That's what he brings now. Presence. One Sunday, he helped me plant rose bushes along the fence line. My knees don't bend like they used to, but I still manage to press the soil down around the roots. Caleb wiped his hands on his jeans and looked at me for a long time. "Did Mom plant roses here?" he asked. I nodded. "She used to say the thorns kept the house honest." He smiled, and for a brief second, I saw her in his face. Not Angela. Not his job. Not the man the world had turned him into. Just the boy we once raised together. After he left that day, I walked back inside and looked around the house. Same creaky floorboards. Same yellowed wallpaper in the hallway. Same chipped plate on the sink from breakfast. It still felt like mine. But not in the way it used to. Not as a fortress. Not as a prize. It felt like a gift I had already given, to the future. The papers were signed months ago. The deed transferred. The non-profit arranged. Once I'm gone, this house won't become someone's investment. It'll become a shelter for youth aging out of foster care. I think Evelyn would be proud. She always said love wasn't something you held tight. It was something you passed on, like sunlight through an open window. One of the counselors from the shelter visited last week to walk through the house. She ran her fingers along the wooden banister and said, "You can feel the history here." I smiled. History's all I have left to give. And this time, it's going to someone who never expected it. Caleb knows. He doesn't say it out loud, but I see it in the way he pauses sometimes when he walks past the old photos on the wall. The way his hand lingers on the back door before leaving. I think he knows this house isn't coming back to him. And yet, he keeps coming. He helps me repair the porch steps. He mows the lawn without being asked. He brings over soup sometimes. No brochures. No pressure. Just soup. He doesn't need the house anymore. And I don't need the apology anymore. We're both learning to live in the space between what we hoped for and what we still have. Maybe that's what forgiveness really is. Not a grand moment of erasing everything that hurt. But learning how to hold each other differently in the aftermath. One Sunday, as he was leaving, Caleb turned back and said, "I know I don't deserve anything from you." I shook my head. "You got one thing." He looked confused. "What?" "One more chance." Then I closed the door behind him, not with anger, but with peace. I stood in the hallway afterward and listened to the quiet. Not the heavy silence from months ago, the kind that used to swallow me whole. This silence was different. It was mine. It was earned. And it no longer felt empty. It felt full. Full of everything I reclaimed. Full of everything I gave. Full of the life I lived, with love and with loss, and with a kind of dignity that no one, not even my own son, could take away.